My journey can be almost broken down into breadcrumbs. That's how I like to describe it. I've always followed breadcrumbs, driven by my two values, which are faith and curiosity.
Welcome to Tearing Up My Heart, Emotional Leadership Lessons, the podcast where we explore the connection between emotions and leadership. In each episode, we will dive into a specific core emotion in an unrehearsed interview of selective high-level leaders. Join me, Jenna Heath, as we navigate the roller coaster of emotions that come with leadership and discover valuable insights that will empower you to become a more emotionally aware and impactful leader. From personal anecdotes to expert interviews, this podcast is your guide to mastering the delicate dance between the heart and the mind. Get ready to tear up old notions and pave the way for a new era of compassionate and effective leadership. Let the journey begin. All right, everyone, welcome back to Tearing Up My Heart. I am so very excited. I start every episode the same way because every time I am genuinely so excited to bring my guests onto the podcast to be able to share their stories with you and hopefully help you in your leadership journey. So today is no different. So I have one of my great friends, my soul sisters, Grace Diaz, with me, who truly, I could not find a better definition of our friendship than a soul sister, because I feel like we are so tethered together and have been for over a decade, which just proof that time is a really weird concept because I feel like we're still 22 years old. So there's that. So thank you for being with us. I am so excited for everyone to be able to connect with you. So if anyone is on Instagram, they can follow you at Buenos Dias with 2 Z's or at Simply Complicated. I will also post them in the description of the podcast. Just a little bit about your very interesting career journey thus far. So you work in human resources. You're currently an HR business partner. More importantly to me, you are an author of this fabulous book, Soul Care, which is a faith-based devotional, I would call it, but truly just kind of an insight of what it's like to walk through your early 20s as a female. So I encourage anyone that even if you don't have a faith, you should still buy the book because I think it really walks you through what it is like in your early 20s as a female and the challenges that it comes along with that. But you have just had a fascinating career, and I think that you truly have worked in HR for a while, but definitely your growth as a leader in terms of traveling all over the world, quite literally, writing a book, working for different organizations. I think you have such a very unique and insightful perspective. So thank you for being with us. So why don't you start by just sharing a little bit about your leadership journey? How did you get to where you are? Let's start with that.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna, firstly, for having me here. And secondly, I'm super excited to share my journey. It is unique, to your point. I'm a visual person, so I'll probably share a lot of imagery in this podcast episode. But with that, my journey can be almost broken down into breadcrumbs. That's how I like to describe it. I've always followed breadcrumbs. Driven by my two values, which are faith and curiosity. So I'm not a big 10-year plan person. I know that works for people, but for me, I follow breadcrumbs. It's easier. It doesn't get me overwhelmed. And that's how I've ended up at this point and where I am in my career, and had a very diverse background. I mean, anyone who knows me well knows I've been in human resources, education. I've published a book. I have a lot of different hats, but I love that. I love doing new things, embarking on new challenges, meeting new people through different experiences. So I've constantly been following those breadcrumbs from going to San Diego State, being part of a leadership emerging leaders program, getting involved in Associated Students, which is where I met Jenna, for all the podcast listeners, who really changed my career. Just a little shout out to Jenna because, like she said, I've traveled to 30 plus countries. I've lived in 3 different countries outside of the US. I've worked in 2 different countries and been part of multiple programs outside the US. But I'm saying all this because Jenna spurred that. And I don't think she knows that. But it was a conversation we had when I was, just on a bench in San Diego State, and she encouraged me to travel abroad, and that really kickstarted it. So when I mentioned breadcrumbs, it's not like I had a big goal to, one day be an HR business leader and have global experiences. It wasn't like that. It was more so me being led by my faith and making decisions based off of faith and curiosity when I had to make those decisions. So long story to your answer, but there you go.
I didn't know that story. Thank you for sharing that breadcrumb about you and I. That is so sweet. And, I teach in one of my leadership classes that there's a really great TED talk about lollipop moments. And I actually was introduced to it by a professor at San Diego State back in the day, over 10 years ago. And I still use it in my classes to this day because it talks about those exact moments. So when we are having, when someone does something that's just so ordinary, like encouraging someone to study abroad, like that's such a normal conversation to have in undergrad. And then it leads to all of these other moments. And in this TED talk, he talks about how essentially that no one ever like goes back and thanks those people for those lollipop moments. So I really appreciate that because I have really tried to live my life and my leadership journey in that way where I'm constantly trying to remember like what are the lollipop moments and going back and thanking people for those moments because so many parts of our lives are just so instrumental by these tiny little things that people do that they don't even know that they did because it was just like a normal Tuesday. So I really appreciate that story. So in a very different direction I feel like we're starting on gratitude, which I love, but that's a completely different emotion than what we're covering today, which is worry. So worry is a state of anxiety or unease about a potential problem or outcome, often accompanied by feelings of fear, uncertainty, or apprehension. It involves dwelling on negative thoughts or potential future events, which can lead to emotional distress and mental preoccupation. I can't think of much things that are worse than that definition. That sounds like a horrific way to live. But ironically, I know I'd share this with you, but so I've read your book quite a few times actually, and you have an entire section in the book called "For the Girls Who Focused on Feelings." And I love that section title so much, but specifically the very first page of that section is calm amidst the chaos. And when I think of the opposite of worry, I think of peace or calmness. That's really what comes to mind. So can you share a little bit about, I guess, the opposite of worry, really? Like how did you develop a space of calmness in your life? Because I truly, when I think about who you were in your early 20s, there was a lot of worry and anxiety. And I think people could feel that when they were around you. You're still like the greatest light and a loving human being, but you were just always really anxious about a lot of things, the future being one of them. And then I saw throughout periods of years where you really developed this sense of peace and calmness and joy. So what did that look like for you?
Yeah, it really is a journey of growth. That plays a big part of it. But I think the real kind of lollipop or come to Jesus moment, for lack of better terms, was when I realized I actually had control over the worry. I recently came across a quote that said, if you want to worry, have at it, but just do so knowing that it's a choice that you're making. And I've currently gotten more into Stoic philosophy. Stoic philosophy. I'm reading a book by Ryan Holiday right now, and one of the chapters it touches on, almost like Zen philosophy. You're on a mountain, things are stable, they're peaceful, serene, but their philosophy is actually the antithesis of that. It's when you're kind of in the middle of Grand Central Terminal Station, how do you maintain that calm and serenity? And it comes back to the fact of the matter, which is, you have control over your judgments and perceptions. So when I realized that, worry is under our control and there are different ways that we can combat worry when it happens, because let's face it, it's not always going to be 70 degrees and sunny outside. maybe in California, but not in real life. So when you come down to realize that, okay, worry is going to happen. I mean, it says, in the Bible, like troubles will come. They're, it's bound to happen in this world, but it's how do you manage them effectively for you in that moment. So I think that was what unlocked it for me and how I've come to this place of knowing my triggers, being more self-aware, which is, a big thing within leadership itself, and a whole different kind of podcast, which won't go into that episode today. But realizing, you have control over it, that really changed the game for me, and was really helpful on my own journey.
Yeah, I think a lot of people give their power away when it comes to worry. And I really imagine as you're talking about this to me, I'm like, that's what taking your power back is, recognizing that you do have some sense of control in this situation. And I've talked about this on previous episodes that, most people struggle with leadership because it is so much unknown. And really, there's only two consistent things in leadership, which is like the unknown and change. Two things that people are deeply uncomfortable with, myself included. And I really think that you have to be willing to lean into this sense of like, you are really not going to be able to control a whole heck of a lot, but the things you can control, your actions and your attitudes, are powerful. And I feel like that's what you just described, is that when you're in that sense of worry, that is a choice. That is an action. Like, it is an action to be like, oh, I'm going to be anxious about this and worried about this. And obviously, we're not going to get into the mental health side of anxiety and the diagnosable disease
Right.
that is. But truly choosing to have worry or anxiety about something is a choice. So I was hoping you could expand on this, because I think worry really shows up in different ways in people's lives, and it manifests differently, and I know that not everyone knows this about me, but I know you do, is that, when I was about to finish college, I was about to graduate, I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, which is an autoimmune illness that attacks your GI tract, and it primarily is due to stress, worry, and anxiety. And I think during that period of life, it was very hard for me to understand, because from the outside looking in, I don't think people would say I was stressed. I was busy, but I don't think people would say I was stressed. And as I've gotten older and progressed in my leadership journey, I've realized worry shows up very differently and it manifests differently for people. For me, it was in physical manifestation of Crohn's disease, but for other people, it could be mental health challenges, depression, weight gain. It really can manifest in a lot of ways. So how did you see that show up in your life, and what did you do to combat that?
Yeah, for me in particular, it was definitely within my mental space, so my thoughts, very worry driven, driven by fears. And for me that was especially challenging because why I'm so passionate about this topic is because worry is debilitating. It paralyzes you. We've all been there in the space where we can't, sometimes you need to take the day off because you are feeling just that pressure of anxiety. And that holds you back. And as a leader and as someone that I'm constantly, I feel like my mission is to drive people forward to make sure that they're making their choices and decisions from a beautiful state of mind. If anyone is familiar with Tony Robbins, he talks a lot about, life working for you, and making those decisions from a beautiful state of mind. So I'm completely, I want to really make sure that folks are making those, staying out of that layer of being paralyzed with fear. And so how it manifests itself with me and how it's held me back in certain areas, when not handled correctly or dealt with in a healthy way is, it can really cause fear within my own, head space. And so I've had to work a lot and do a lot of work, which takes time and, still having compassion and grace for myself. It's not always, I'm not always going to get it right every time, but in training my thoughts in, making sure that I am making conscious, I have a lot of different ways to kind of combat, challenge my thoughts, reframe things, know when, you can feel the worry sometimes. I get it a lot in my stomach area, those physical manifestations that you mentioned. So it takes time, I think, to get to know yourself a little bit, and you have to, have some self-compassion for yourself. But for me, that has been a big thing with figuring out, the right ways to combat those thoughts. And I can, share some tips and tools that I have in my toolkit if you'd like as well.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, I would love for you to expand on that. And I was just thinking of the irony, or how perfect this is, rather, that your name is Grace, and how I feel like you had to learn to give yourself grace. The irony of that statement is kind of funny to me, but I think that so many leaders struggle with this. Is the idea of giving ourselves grace to understand that we're going to have challenges as leaders and as people. We're going to have worries. We're going to have anxieties. Like, that is part of being an adult on planet Earth. I don't think it's anyone's favorite part, but it is certainly a part of it. So yeah, can you share a little bit about some of the tricks you use, and really how you started to teach your mind how to behave? Because I think, back to your original comment, I also think that's a choice. I think a lot of times we let our minds run rampant and we think we have no control in that situation, when in reality, like, we teach other people how to treat us. We also teach ourselves how to treat us, and we don't always teach
Right.
ourselves the right thing.
Yeah, no, you are so right in that. And if there's one thing, that I hope will stand out in this podcast, it is that we do have choice over what we choose to dwell on and our thoughts. And one specific one that for me, I mean, I'll lay out a buffet and the listeners can kind of pick and choose what they'd like to take. But one that has, worked for me is definitely the four S's. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but the four S's to kind of challenge your thoughts or get curious about them. One is silence, one is softness, the other one is seriousness, and then the other one is silly. So, say for instance, if you're like, you have, a thought come up out of nowhere and you're just like, whoa, this is not serving me, you can be like, not today. You can choose to respond in like a serious way, like, not today, this isn't happening, I gotta, make it to work. Or you can do like very, compassionate, I'm with you, I feel you, but we're gonna get through this. Or you can do like very, silly, like, this is, you're funny, like, you tried at it again, not happening today, like, just make it. And it just kind of like alleviates that. Or, thinking about how you would respond to a friend. um Another powerful one, which is, I really encourage listeners to dig more into if they'd like to take it a step further. But it's The Work by Byron Katie. It's four simple, questions you can ask yourself, like, is it true? How do I know it's true? Is this serving me? And then, how would I react if I believe that this thought were true? So again, very like simple ones that you can also, like, when, sometimes we don't really have all the time in the world to just like go and like challenge. So simple, more practical ones that I've used are even like just breaking down the cycle, like putting on some scented lotion just to smell it really quickly, going back to those like five senses. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I just very simple ways, because I think we've all been there, where it's like in the middle of work, things are happening, we don't really have time to go take a 30-minute walk outside, even no matter how much we'd love to. But simple ones. And I think also too, another thing is realizing, or is also preparing yourself in advance, having a toolkit, a little list of frameworks that work for you, because there's a plethora of, options that we can choose from, but finding ones that work for yourself and then having them to just come back to time again. And what you mentioned, have grace and compassion for yourself, because these things take time and we're all human. We're not always going to get it right, but that's what it's about. It's about, growing and trying again.
Yeah, I love those tools. And it's so funny too, because I think sometimes people naturally do some of these things, but don't recognize what they're doing. And so it's kind of less powerful because they don't know. It's like grounded in truth and grounded in research and a proven factual response to an emotion, right? So I always think about when I was in college, I worked, through college to pay for everything by bartending and serving tables and things like that. And it's actually how I met my husband. Pro tip: serve somewhere and meet your future spouse. But I would always, almost every single shift, I would get so stressed and so overwhelmed and so like overburdened with worry that I would run into our walk-in freezer at the restaurant, and I would just stand there. And if anyone's ever worked at a restaurant, those things are kept at like 20 degrees. It's literally, quite literally below freezing. And I would just stand there for like 3, 4, 5 minutes, really however long I could get myself to suffer. And it would calm my nervous system now. And it's so funny because now here I am like 15 years later, and my husband and I bought a cold plunge. Like, we love cold plunging, and so many people are like, you are psychotic, that water is so cold and you just sit there. And I'm like, I've trained myself that is how I regulate my emotions, and it really helps me. And so, but 15 years ago, I had no idea that's what I was doing. When I was running to the freezer at a restaurant, I was just like, I need to calm down and not yell at this customer. Now I'm like, wow, this is an emotional response to the situation and a way to regulate myself. Like, how awesome is that? So I love those tools, and hopefully some of those things are actionable items for people. And I've found that that's something that I've gotten a lot of positive feedback from this podcast, is people are like, I love the stories, but I love the like actionable thoughts of like, you can do this to help with this. And so I think those were awesome tools for that. So I want to go an interesting direction with this, and I hope you're comfortable with this. Just a reminder to our listeners, this is an unrehearsed podcast, so no one has any idea what I'm going to say before I say it, sometimes not even me. But I really wanted you to kind of talk about the cultural and societal expectations of worry. I'm married to someone who identifies as Mexican/Peruvian, and it comes from a very different culture than me, and I have learned a lot about cultural intelligence being married to someone from a different culture. But I also think I learned a lot of that from having friends like you who come from a different background. And you've probably learned so much of this traveling all over the world. And so I was hoping you could share just a little bit about how you feel like culture or societal expectations influence how individuals perceive or experience worry in their own life.
Yeah, I love that you asked this question because that's definitely a lesson that I took away from me from the last season that I had living abroad, which just kind of closed a few weeks ago, as I returned to the US. And one of the things that I realized, sometimes I think when you take yourself out of an environment, you get a lot of perspective. So by kind of taking myself out of the US hustle 25/8 working culture, you realize how much of it is ingrained in just your environment and the society that you live in. While I was abroad and kind of had some space from the US and this culture of you know worry and working and burnout and within HR we hear a lot of for people to take off like a month is something very novel versus like when you go to some European countries, it's like you don't take off during the summer, like what. That was definitely something I learned just by having conversations and by living in a different culture where the relationship between work and life and that balance is a lot more um, union. I don't know the right word for it, but it's a lot more healthy, I guess, is would be kind of how I would explain it. And I think to kind of go dig more into your question, I think it also is just kind of taking yourself out of the environment from time to time and realizing, what might be you versus like what, the culture or the what you've grown up exposed to. That can really change. And so maybe taking just a step and reevaluating. And I think that happened a lot with during COVID and during the pandemic was people realized that realized a lot of a lot but in relation to the question, in terms of realizing kind of the what really matters and that balance and not making work your entire life, but making work a part of it. Um, if that helps answer your question at all.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think you bring up so many valid points. Is that I think part of it is how we're raised, and I think especially. Well, actually, your book talks about this, but when you're growing up in those early 20 phases, I think part of it is learning, how we were raised. Doesn't mean it was wrong. It doesn't mean our parents didn't try their absolute best, or whoever was involved in raising us. People do the best they can with what's available to them always, well, most of the time. But I think that as you navigate into those early years of being an adult and potentially being a leader, you learn a lot about how maybe you want to perceive the world. And I think worry is one of those areas, is that it's very easy that when we're raised in a home where maybe you have a worry wart as a mom, or an overly involved dad who is just like kind of on top of everything, whatever. Neither of those were my experiences, but I've heard from other people that can be the case. And I think that sometimes we experience that, and then as we get older, we're like, oh, I don't love those tendencies. Like, it's not that my parents are bad people. That's just, I don't love those tendencies and I don't want to live that way. And I think that for a lot of people, it is difficult for them to separate the idea of potentially like honoring their family and honoring their culture to making decisions about how they want to behave in certain ways. And so I see this pop up a lot when it comes to worry and stress and anxiety, because some people were just raised in homes where that's common. And that's really, and maybe parents or guardians are oversharing with challenges that they have, and in an effort to be transparent and build relationships, but don't necessarily see how that's passing on a pretty dramatic generational curse, I would say. So what are your thoughts
Mhm.
about that when it comes to, I guess, the generational curse side of worry?
I love that you bring that up, and it reminds me of one pivotal decision that I had to make in my journey, which is I love quotes, by the way. I think you're gonna realize that. But one quote that I love, it says, what got you here won't always get you to where you want to go. And I think when I came to that realization in my journey, that maybe worry at some point in my life in a way did help. I mean, it can really spear you if managed correctly. It can really drive you. But once it stops serving you, you always have the opportunity to change. I mean, we are adaptable. We are resilient people. We always can be empowered to do that. And I think once I realized that I am my own person. I am not my family. I am not my environment. I am my own person. That helped me a lot in terms of reevaluating, almost like an archaeologist. That's how I like to show up in a lot of places that I go to. It's like, oh, that's interesting. You're observing things without judgment. And once you kind of take a step back and are able to look at life through that lens and just getting a little bit more curious, you can start realizing like, oh, oh wow, like that is not me, like, or maybe that is like me and my mom's relationship. I'm like, oh, I definitely get that from you. But yeah, like we can always, we can choose to rewire us. And again, it's in a spirit of love. I am choosing something else for my own life because it's not serving me. So, in terms of generational curses, I do have a chapter on that particular topic, and because that's been a big thing for me, especially growing up as you know a Mexican American woman, with so I there were a lot of things, and sometimes you just don't even realize it that you have certain narratives, but we really become who we are. Our communication styles are really cultivated, a lot of that during childhood. And so I think it does require a lot of a lot of work to kind of reevaluate that. But in a way, I think it's very empowering to just realize that you are your own person and you get to make the decisions for yourself. And there's always a different story that you can start writing at any point in your life.
I love that idea of writing your own story because I think that again it just takes so much of the power back into our own hands to say like, okay, like I am in control of my own life. And I feel like that is really where I see people get stuck oftentimes and worry. And I think especially kind of looking at the leadership lens of worry, I suppose, I've said this pretty much every podcast episode, and I think it's so true, is that leadership is difficult. It is not for the faint of heart. I think far too many people are hoisted into leadership roles that are not ready for them, that don't want them, or just really aren't adequately prepared. But I often see it manifest in worry, is that leaders are faced with challenging situations, and instead of maybe leaning into that, asking curious questions, trying to find mentors that can help them, whether that's a leadership coach or a therapist. I have both. I think they both bring value. But I think that I often see this manifest in worry, is that because so many leaders are not self-aware of what is happening in their own body, their stress and anxiety automatically pops up as worry. So I'm curious,
Mm-hmm.
especially from kind of like the HR lens of what you do for work, if you could talk a little bit about when leaders are faced with situations like that and it's manifesting as worry, what should they do? Like, what is the first thing they should do when faced with a challenge and they're so stressed and so worried and so full of anxiety? What is a better alternative?
First and foremost, don't react. Sit with it for a second. It can be really easy to just react in the moment, but it would be to take a pause, take a breath when faced with that. We're all going to be hit with that worry at some point, but that would be my number one thing. Is to take that moment. That a 5 second breather can make so much of a difference, and I'm sure we can all attest to that. Just taking that 5 seconds. Another thing in relation to the self awareness is just realizing and being vulnerable. I think that's a huge thing. Brene Brown talks a lot about vulnerability and leadership, and the relationship with the two, but it would be even acknowledging sometimes, seeking support from a teammate, or even acknowledging if it happens on a meeting or, in a conversation. It's like there's a conscious leadership tool called above and below the line. And, when lead and acknowledge and realizing when you're above the line, you're making choices from a growth mindset, you're open, you're collaborative. But when you're sometimes below the line, and it happens, we're all going to be above and below the line at some point during our careers, but when you are below the line and feeling that worry, feeling that fear, and making decisions from more of a closed, paralyzed, fearful basis, it can be important to just acknowledge that, to have even those around you that you're surrounded with, in a way, just say, hey, I'm like a little below the line right now. You don't need to go into all the specific details, but that can really be a game changer. And I know it does require a level of vulnerability, but that is leadership. It's being vulnerable. It's being willing to say, I don't have the answers. I'm not at 100% right now. It's having that sense of self-awareness, to realize, like, we all have the days when we're showing up to work and we're at our A game, but I'm not there, so I'm going to pass the baton to you today, or help me through this, or help me to brainstorm with this. It's Leadership cannot be done alone. We need a tribe. That's why we have a team. That's why we're surrounded by others. And I think that that's a big approach sometimes, is just leaning into that vulnerability, and trying it. I know it's not always easy, but that would be my advice, is just to kind of realize, once you become self-aware, just kind of being okay with saying, like, I am feeling it. Like, don't try to push it, shove it away. Just really let it kind of flow through you. And the beautiful thing is that fear is a feeling, anxiety, it flows through you. Eventually it will pass. Rumi, the Sufi poet, he has a beautiful poem called The Guest House. And he says, when these feelings come, invite them in, welcome them in, then show them out the door. Moving your body in a loving way, let those feelings flow through you. It'll come and go, and you'll be back at it. But I think again, it's just acknowledging it, being aware, and maybe being a little bit vulnerable, dare I say it, in the workplace.
It's so true though. I mean, Dare to Lead, great book by Brene Brown, all about empathy and leadership. And I think I give that actually to a lot of my team members as gifts because it's was a book that totally changed my perspective when it comes to leadership. I feel like I was very much so raised in an industry as a leader that is very closed off and very like you are meant to look perfect and you're meant to behave a certain way, and learning that like leadership actually is meant to be a vulnerable lived experience with other people in community was a total game changer for me and really changed how I behave around other people, how I lead other people. And like you said, I'm not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I have certainly had some wild experiences at work where I know I didn't show up perfectly, but I'm always in progression and I'm always trying to be better. And I think that is how leaders show up, is always trying to be better and working forwards towards the best version of themselves. So I really appreciate that concept. So I wanted to talk to you about something that I think you'll have an interesting perspective of because you are not really like a traditional millennial when it comes to technology and social media. And, I wouldn't say those are like your high interest areas, but we do see in the research that technology and worry are very closely correlated. So I'm curious your perspective on how you believe technology in the modern digital age contributes or potentially alleviates worry. What are your thoughts around that hot button topic?
Ooh, I have to say, I think the jury's still out on that one. But in my most recent opinion, I think in my perspective, I feel like boundaries are key when it comes to technology and using it as a weapon to drive you forward or to pull you back. Right now, I'll be very honest, and vulnerable. I am currently on a social media cleanse just because sometimes you got to do what you have to do. And if you don't find that something's serving you, I feel like that's the theme of this podcast. It's you have the choice and the power. You have the choice to, set that boundary for yourself. And for me, I think it can be very powerful. I use technology, ChatGPT, all the things in the workplace. It can be very powerful and helpful. But if you do find yourself, that it's not serving you, I think that it can definitely have those correlations with worry. And the beautiful thing is that the way that technology has evolved, I get alerts sometimes, like if I'm hitting a certain, I got an alert the other day that I was like using too much audio. It can be helpful. So it's the technology is looking out for us. But I will say, I think that it definitely can be correlated. That goes without saying, to worry and fear. And you just see so much on there. There's so much happening in the world. I mean, it's, if you're not worried at some point throughout the week, I am actually concerned because there's just a lot happening in the world right now. So worry, it's going to happen. It's going to be there. It's how do you know, stand up against it? How do you sort through and navigate through it? So I definitely, yeah, I can see how the two would be correlated.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate that thought that, if you're living in the modern world today and you don't experience worry in some way, shape, or form, I don't think you're human, to be honest with you, or you're living under a rock. One of the two. Yeah. But I do, I think you brought up a really important point of boundaries. And I think that I've recognized a theme with some of my other podcast guests is that people like to institute boundaries with other people, which are certainly very powerful. I am a huge proponent of boundaries when it comes to toxic people, toxic environments, all of that, 100%. But I also think that people struggle to understand that you can set boundaries with yourself. Right? iPhone, great example. You can set timers of how long you can be on social media. You can, set timers for apps, things like that. Like that's a really easy way to envision setting a boundary for yourself. But something that I have had to learn throughout my journey is setting boundaries with myself mentally. So, like for example, my husband and I have a rule that for 1 minute every day after work, we're allowed to complain about work because that's natural. I mean, like you could have the best job in the world and you're still going to have some complaints. Like, again, human beings on planet Earth. But the boundary we decided to set with ourselves was like, we both have 1 minute, because otherwise we totally spiral out of control. And all of a sudden it's 2 hours, and all we've done is complain about the other 8 hours before that. And I'm like, that's not healthy. I mean, some people would like to say
Right.
that, a certain level of venting is healthy. I think if you're venting 2 hours a day about your job, you either don't have the right job or you need a better therapist. I'm not sure which, because that's a lot. That's a lot. And so I'm
Yeah.
curious, what do you think are some maybe mental, physical, or emotional boundaries we can set within ourselves so that we can, one, start to recognize when those emotions are piling up on us and do something about it, but also, two, that we actually start to build the habit of setting boundaries with ourselves?
I love that. And before I answer that question, I do want to marry it back to your earlier question about how, this might play into culture and being because I think especially being, a Mexican woman or even being a woman, um we can take on a lot. I think we tend to really take responsibility for a lot of other people's emotions and feelings and thoughts, and we can want to be that person. We're just wired this way, or maybe it's just me, but I definitely find that that is boundaries are key in that. You need them because in order, I think we've all heard it, in order to pour out to others, you need to yourself have your cup filled. And we always hear that the strongest leaders have the biggest boundaries. And it's not, I know it's a taboo word, and it can feel very like hard and stone cold, but it's not that. It's really protecting yourself so that way you can be your best and show up your best in this world. So I did want to kind of just call that out because I think there's a different level of how it ties into being, especially a woman, or coming from a different culture where you're supposed to be that archetype of being the rock, being there for others, and taking on that responsibility. And I would really encourage those who might be listening that to live a little bit more unapologetically, and to be a little more okay with saying no, and yeah. So I just want to, I felt it on my heart to say that. But going back to your question about how to kind of establish those boundaries, and know kind of where you're, when to establish those boundaries would be, for me, I think it's again over time, knowing your triggers, knowing when you get those impulses. So I think we've mentioned before, sometimes it's bodily emotions. For me, I know there are certain hours of the day where I am just tend to not be as on it, so to speak. I don't have my normal energy levels. Like if you text me after 8 p.m., I'm not gonna be, very, very responsive. I'm like getting ready for bed. So I think, just knowing yourself again, coming over, going over time, and learning yourself. But that would be two of my responses to that answer.
Yeah, I think those are really powerful and helpful tools. And something that I thought about too in regards to setting kind of like my own boundaries and leadership is, and again, I'm not perfect at this because I know there are some people on my team that listen to this podcast and they're going to be like, you do that like once a month. So progression, always progression. But one of the things that I tried to do a couple years ago was I found a couple really close people in my workplace that I could kind of text on a whim and be like, hey, I need a walk. And this was a way I actually set like a mental boundary for myself, is that there's just those moments in your leadership and in your career journey where you just feel overwhelmed, inundated, worried, stressed. And instead of allowing myself just to push through those moments, I decided to give myself space to feel those emotions with safe people that I knew would help validate those emotions and help me work through them. And instead of being like, oh, just keep going, right? Because I think we do live in this hustle culture in America that As I identify as like a highly high achieving person that, if it was up to me, I
Mhm.
probably would work like 20 hours a day. Maybe not like on a full like 9 to 5 situation, but like on passion projects and things that I love to do and things that I think add value to the world, just because I love achieving. It's definitely part of my
Right.
DNA, I would say. And I think there's a good chunk of society who has made that villainized, is that, high achievers and wanting to be successful is a bad thing, when in reality, I don't think that's the case at all. I think hustle culture, where you feel like you are constantly trying to achieve the next best thing, yeah, I don't think that's super healthy. And so that is one of the things that I was able to implement that actually was quite a game changer for me. And, I don't do it every day. I don't even do it once a week. But in those moments where I feel really challenged by worry and stress and anxiety, I like text those people and I'm like, I need a walk. Even if it's 15 minutes, it makes such a big difference, because then I can kind of come back and be like, okay, I set that mental boundary for myself. I did the thing to take care of myself, and now I'm ready to work and I'm ready to be productive.
Right.
And I think that that has made such a big difference in my leadership journey, because I just wasn't giving myself space to feel those emotions. And then, like you said earlier, that was really resulting in the need for way more therapy than I already needed, and burnout, so much burnout. And I think that, I really had to have a come to Jesus moment with myself of being like, is my career the problem? Is my leadership journey the problem? Or am I the problem? And I think if you don't have like really successful boundaries in place with yourself, oftentimes it isn't the people around you, it isn't your workplace, like it's a you problem. And I think that's a really hard thing to say to yourself.
Oh no, I was gonna say I want to just add on that thought, and I love that you mentioned that because I think also you may have touched on this in an earlier podcast, but it's those rituals. Having those concrete rituals can really make all the difference. For me, it's waking up, it's journaling, it's doing devotionals in the morning. It's a different Grace when I don't do that. It's having those hard boundaries. You're stopping work at a certain hour. I just recently started going to a WeWork because I realized, working from home is not serving me. And so it's, again, to your point, sometimes it's really easy to point the finger and not look at the three fingers pointing back at you, but it can very much well be a you problem. Most of the time it is, like you said.
Yeah. And I think that is such a hard thing to admit to ourselves, is that we are the problem. Taylor Swift would love this episode right now. But it's so true, is that it is significantly easier to blame someone else or an organization or a culture, when in reality, I really often actually stop myself and I'm like, okay, what is my side of the street clean? Right? Or did I really screw up? Did I do something wrong? Did I behave in a way that is not authentic to the leader that I am trying to be? And I have learned to take those pauses very frequently, because I am an imperfect person and I don't do things perfectly all the time, or even well all the time. But that has helped me a lot, is to take those moments and be like, okay, wait, is this about all this other stuff, or is this about me? And is this an opportunity for me to potentially lean into my leadership journey and say like, hey, I'm going to take some ownership over an experience, a problem, something that occurred, and be like, you know what? I think this was my bad. I think this was my bad, and I take ownership of that. And that actually, to your point at the very beginning of the podcast, has actually alleviated a lot of worry for me, because it's allowed me to realize that more often than not, I am actually in control of my sense of worry. Because the second that I take responsibility for some of those things, I'm like, oh, wow, that also means I have the ability to fix this, and I have the ability to change. And that's really powerful.
Right.
So I would love for us to wrap up with, in my opinion, one of the most difficult emotions, which is fear. And I know that you've listened to the first few episodes of the podcast, and so this question shouldn't come as a surprise to you. But I have found this question to be fascinating, because everyone's answer is so different. So the question, of course, is, if you had no fear, no anxiety, nothing like that in your mind and your heart and your body and your soul, what would you be doing with your life?
What's funny? I knew you were gonna ask this question, but it doesn't make it easier to respond to. Um, Again, in the beginning of the podcast, I said I'm a visual person. I would see myself on a flight somewhere across the pond, doing some sort of consulting work for cross-cultural communication and leadership. That is really where my heart's desire is, and that would be my answer.
I love that. That's a beautiful answer and totally goes in alignment with like who you are as a human. I think that, I'm waiting for the moment for me to ask someone that question and then them to flip it on me and be like, what would you do if you had no fear? And I'm like, I literally said this in an earlier podcast episode. And I'm like, I think everything. Because I think so many, like, I would love to say I'm one of those people that like, I have no fear. And in reality, I don't think I struggle with fear as much as some other folks, but I do definitely hold myself back in areas that, like, good Lord, it took me like 2 years to launch this podcast because I was like, oh, I don't have enough time, or, no one really needs this. Like, there's not a need. No one will listen. And granted, like, I think that people would be like, oh, those aren't rooted in fear. And I'm like, those are most definitely rooted in fear in some way, shape, or form. So I appreciate your answer there because when I think about you, I totally envision this like honestly like a DEI leader, like someone that can really speak to diversity, equity, and inclusion, how that affects leadership, how like the cross-cultural components interact with those things. I totally see a future for you in that space. So I will be your number one cheerleader all the way.
Thank you. And me cheerleading you on, I want to highlight the fact that even though, regardless that you had the fear, you still did it. And that's the difference. It's because it's when fear doesn't paralyze you or stop you, we're always going to have some sort of fear because that means we're challenging ourselves. Fear can be really a good thing because it really shows you, like, oh, wow, I'm doing something that's out of my comfort zone. This is good. But the fact that you are here doing it, that's everything.
Well, thank you for saying that. That is very kind. And I said this to someone recently, but I think that, my goal in this season of my life is I just want to be an example to other people that you can do the things that you want to do. It doesn't matter how busy you are. It doesn't matter how much experience you have. It doesn't matter what your life looks like. Like, if you want to do something, you can. You are the only person holding you back. And that has certainly been like the mantra of my life the last few years is like, I am the only person holding me back, which again, it actually is a really relieving feeling to know that I have more power in the situation than I think I ever realized.
I love that. It's like we carry energy, and I think sometimes we forget it. But sometimes you will change someone's life, and like to your point earlier, you just don't know it, by something that you did, a move that you made that, being in a room, as a woman or being in a room as, a Mexican American or a different race and just being that example for someone to be like, oh, I can do that too. Sometimes we just don't know who we're there to encourage. So just remembering that is something to carry with us.
Absolutely. And what a perfect way for us to end. So thank you again for being with us. I am so excited to hear folks' feedback on this podcast because you are just a beautiful light in the world. And I think this is going to bless so many lives. So thank you again for being with us. Thank you for joining us today on Tearing Up My Heart Emotional Leadership Lessons podcast. I hope you learned so much and are ready to tear up old notions and get started on your leadership journey. Make sure to follow us at jheathmoreno, and I hope you'll join us next time.